Hello, everyone. I'm Russell Gay, Associate Professor of Management and David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics. Welcome back to the Faculty and Staff Ethics Interview Series. Today's guest is Kirsten Juhl. Kirsten is an instructor of real estate, third year here at UNI. She spent 13 years as an attorney, undergrad from UNI, law school at Iowa. She's also on the board of directors for Exceptional Persons and the Northeast Iowa Food Bank. And I think we're going to talk about ethics in real estate and probably in law today as well. So welcome, Kirsten. Thank you for taking time for this.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here and talk with you.
Sounds good. So where do you want to start? Do you want to start on the real estate side?
Sure.
Okay, so I'll let you kind of guide this ship, the direction you want it to go. And let's just talk a little bit about the ethical dealings and things, whether it's the classroom, whether it's the actual side of real estate out in the real world or wherever you want to go.
Okay. Well, I think there are ethical angles to just about anything that you can study.
Very true.
So when we're talking about real estate, there are a lot of different ethical sort of hot button issues. And from my background, a lot of those things sort of overlap with law. So maybe this will be sort of a real estate and law mashup.
Nice.
In a way. One of the biggest topics that we talk about, even at the beginning of real estate classes, is how there are a lot of laws, there are a lot of rules when it comes to real estate. There's a lot of just history there. But one of the things that maybe we know intuitively, but need to sort of explicitly say, is that what is legal is not always what is ethical.
Sure.
And what is ethical is not always the legal thing.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing that comes up in real estate in a few ways. Even in the most basic, in our real estate courses, we're talking about this concept of property. And what does that mean? Where does that come from? And the fact that really, without laws in a civilized society, we don't have property. That's
Sure.
not a thing that we can have. But there's also this sort of social contract that goes beyond just the letter of the law that says that we're respecting each other's property, we're all respecting the rules in a way that makes our society and our economy possible.
Okay.
Now, one thing we talk about with property, one of the early ethical questions that we talk about is this concept of property and what that means, the ability to use and acquire, dispose of property, and even talking about things like, okay, real estate makes sense, but what about other types of property? Is my body my own property? Well, if it is property, then how does that interplay with this idea of being able to sell, like say an organ or something
Sure.
like that?
Sure.
And talking about those kinds of things. In the more
I hadn't thought of organs as real estate related before.
Well, not real property, but in personal property.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it makes sense.
And so in order to understand real property, we
Yeah,
have to understand property overall.
sure.
When we get into more of the practical side of like actually working in real estate, things like that, there are a lot of places where ethics comes in. One big one is this idea of agency and brokers and salespeople representing their clients.
Sure.
And there's these codes of ethics that the law imposes on those folks, but also there are some gray areas, like there is with anything. At what point do you have a duty to the other party in a transaction to make sure things are disclosed properly? Ethical duties that kind of align with laws on things like bias and discrimination. Okay. Where do those boundaries fall in? Even if you can't prove legally that bias is happening, what's our responsibility ethically?
Exactly.
So those are a few just overall things that I say are big topics that come up.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I'm sure the students get a ton out of that particular course. And
well, I hope it makes them think a little bit, because the first few times I thought it through explicitly, really kind of was a brain bender a little bit.
Yeah. Like I told you before we started the recording, I teach negotiations, and a couple of the cases I do involve the real estate world and so on and so forth. So we should definitely talk sometime about
that would be good. Yeah.
too. I cover the ethics material in there, but obviously not in the depth that you probably would from a real estate perspective. So it's good to hear about some of this.
Yeah.
So how'd you make the transition into the real estate world from the law side of things earlier in your career?
Well, when I first started out in private practice, so right after I got out of law school, I was working for an attorney. Well, I was working for a law firm primarily with one partner, and real estate was a huge part of his practice.
Okay.
So that was one of the reasons I went there. I was just interested in it. I just liked it. Um, I like the idea that we can plan ahead in real estate. I
Sure.
never really liked the litigation piece where we're trying to clean things up from before. I felt like with real estate, we're making a plan and we're going to accomplish something and we're going to do things along the way to get to a good outcome.
Exactly.
And so I love that. And I love that ability to really get into those contracts and get into those really the minutia even of agreements to make sure we're all on the same page and we can actually avoid conflict
Right.
later on.
Yeah.
So that's how I started. And then it's just kind of continued to be a big part of my um, practice ever since. It really was the whole time. And then I got connected with Art Cox at
Mhm.
UNI and started getting involved with some things through UNI and then became an adjunct. And now here I am.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, in either of those paths, whether we're talking about the legal profession or real estate, I mean, ethics is pretty much a daily, well, more frequent than that, but a daily occurrence and something
Yeah.
that's always on your radar.
Yes, absolutely. And I think too, that's something that's important for people to realize at the beginning of their legal career is that there's so many ethical rules that apply to attorneys. But sometimes that's hard. Sometimes
Sure.
we're, you know, innately, we know the right thing to do. And in some cases, the law says, I can't do that because of my ethical obligations to my
Right.
client.
Right.
And that can
Yeah.
really be some conflict internally that you have to kind of work through. And that's a big part of deciding kind of what your practice is going to look like
Of course.
and making sure in whatever area you're going into that you're comfortable with those decisions that you have to make.
Exactly. Good. What
Yeah.
sort of advice, ethics related advice do you have for the students, whether they're looking for either of those career paths, somebody that might want to go to law school in the future versus your current students in the real estate track? What sort of overall key takeaways or things do you hope that they leave with from your class related to the ethics world?
Well, I hope that as far as kind of the law side, especially if they're thinking about going into a law practice, I would really encourage them to take the time to not just go through the motions of learning about the legal
Sure.
system, but actually like spend some time with that and wrestle with that a little bit because the system is designed so that everyone has their advocate, whether you're in a courtroom or you're in an office practice.
Absolutely.
Um, and this idea is that if everyone has their advocate and we're all playing within these legal rules, then the right result will come out of that. Now, that doesn't always happen. I think doesn't always happen, but I do think it's something where we really have to think about how that process plays out. And I know some people who have gone into like criminal law and defending
Sure.
criminal defendants, and they say, well, I think they did it. How do I defend them?
Yeah.
And going back to this idea that, okay, even if that's the case, thinking through what your ethical obligations are under rules for attorneys and why they're that way, and thinking through why those rules are in place and what the outcome should be if everyone's doing their part.
Okay.
But that's something to kind of work through, I think. As far as just students, I remember being a student for a long time and feeling like I was so in the weeds sometimes, just so focused on getting through a class or learning the material to pass a test that I didn't always take the time that I wish I would have
Sure.
to really absorb some of those things and think about who it made me as a person and what I really thought about it. And I love it when I'm talking to students and I can see them actually taking time
The
to think
light
through the
bulb is
ethical
going
questions.
off.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes we'll be asking, I try and pull ethical discussions, not legal
Right.
discussions, ethical discussions from a lot of different areas. So we'll talk about the one I mentioned earlier. We'll talk about what about public access to beaches? If
Sure.
people have purchased beachfront property, is it right that they can exclude the public, even though, the
Wow.
government technically owns to the high water mark?
Sure.
Um, but those people also have paid a lot of money. They have privacy rights. They have all these. So balancing those different rights of people
Yeah.
and asking students to think through, um, does the law match what's right? What should it be in an ethical society? So I would, that's a long answer to say, I
No,
would
you're
really
doing
encourage
good.
students to not just think through like, well, I think this, but really to give that some thought and think about what they believe is the right thing to do and
Exactly.
make that a habit. Because when we get out in the real world, so to speak, um, not only is that, I think, the best way to live, but it's going to serve them well
Right.
in
Right.
their profession.
And when it comes to ethics, I think one of the best ways to learn it is the whole ethical dilemma situation anyway, where we can make
Mhm.
an argument, maybe not as strongly on one side as we can on the other, but still we can see both perspectives and both sides there
Yeah,
and try to come to the best solution possible. So yeah, I think that works pretty well. Well,
yeah,
thank you.
definitely.
Yeah. Anything else you might want to cover?
Not unless you have a specific question. I don't think so. It's an interesting thing to talk about always.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. We'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, I would like that.
Yeah, well, thank you again. I've enjoyed it. I think the students will as well. And again, thank you for taking time with us this morning.
Thank you. It's been a great talk.
Thank you.